I call to order the fourth informal meeting of the plenary on public health crisis emanating from the Ebola virus outbreak. As noted in my letter dated 13th February 2015, I have invited Mr. Ismail Odi Sheikh Ahmed, Special Representative and Head of the United Nations Mission for Ebola Emergency Response, and Dr. David Nabarro, Special Envoy of the Secretary General on Ebola, to brief the members. I take this opportunity to warmly welcome our distinguished guests to this meeting. The report on the work of the United Nations in response to the Ebola outbreak, covering developments from 1st of January 2014 to 1st of February 2015, has been circulated in document A/69/759. It records activities carried out by the Special Envoy on Ebola and UNMIR and provides an update on progress made in the Ebola response since the previous report of 12th January 2015, contained in document S/69/720, and pursuant to decision of Secretary General and in furtherance to Resolution 69/1 of 19 September 2014. Your Excellencies, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, Secretary General, Mr. Ismail Odi Sheikh Ahmed, Special Representative of the Secretary General and Head of the United Nations Mission for Ebola Emergency Response, Dr. David Nabarro, Special Envoy of the Secretary General on Ebola, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all for attending this important briefing. I thank Mr. Ismail Odi Sheikh Ahmed for his important work on the ground and extend my appreciation to Dr. David Nabarro for his continued leadership on this issue. Since our last briefing, important progress has been made with respect to combating the Ebola outbreak in Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia. I once again commend the people and governments of the affected countries for their unflinching efforts. I also thank the regional and international partners for their support that has made a tangible difference. While we should all feel heartened by the progress that has been made, we cannot yet claim triumph over Ebola. With the rainy season quickly approaching, we must redouble our efforts to ensure a final successful push for eliminating this epidemic, but also begin to direct our attention to the region's long-term recovery efforts. Excellencies, the most affected countries still face serious challenges, particularly with regard to their long-term social recovery. The devastating impact of Ebola outbreak could seriously compromise their sustainable development efforts. Key sectors remain gravely affected. There is a great risk that long after this epidemic has passed, the healthcare crisis in the most affected countries could continue, resulting in many otherwise preventable deaths. The health infrastructure is the hardest hit. Countries must be rebuilt into strong, resilient institutions. Although many children are finally now returning to class, there will be long-term education needs and gaps due to the fact that schools in the affected countries were closed for extended periods of time. We must do what we can to ensure the necessary resources are put into place so all children are given every opportunity to resume their education. Furthermore, steps must also be taken to ensure better epidemic preparedness and response for the future, including through human resource capacity building, infrastructure development, and more robust governance and regional institutions. It is essential that regional and international partners support and strengthen the efforts of the national government in a coordinated manner. And as the situation gets better, it is also crucial that all partners in the region plan and manage their exit in a way that will ensure that capacity is transferred amply to national institutions. I urge you all to continue to support the affected countries, combat the epidemic, as well as embark on long-term recovery. The commitment made by regional leaders of the Mano River Union in their declaration of 15th February 2015 to achieve zero Ebola infection within 60 days was a clear demonstration of the region's resolve to combat Ebola. We must give them our full support. As we contemplate the long-term needs of the region, the high-level international conference on Ebola on the 3rd of March in Brussels, being organized by the European Union and other key partners, represents an important opportunity to demonstrate solidarity with the countries most affected by Ebola. I call on you all to continue to support the affected countries as they embark on a long journey for full recovery. I thank you for your kind attention. I now give the floor to the Secretary General of the United Nations, His Excellency, Mr. Ban Ki-moon.
Your Excellency, Mr. Sam Kutesa, President of the General Assembly, Excellencies, esteemed colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. We met 5 months ago when the world was coming to terms with an unprecedented outbreak of Ebola in West Africa. The outbreak was gaining ground every hour, outpacing response efforts. You recognize the grave threat that Ebola posed to the region and beyond. You welcome the deployment of the United Nations Mission for Ebola Emergency Response, UNMEER, the first of its kind in the history of the United Nations. Local, national, regional, and international capacities mobilized in solidarity with the affected communities and countries to support nationally led response efforts. With the leadership of President Conde, Koroma, and Sirleaf Johnson, national governments and communities took proactive steps to protect themselves, leading to reduced risks of infection and lower incidence rates. Today, we face a critical turning point. The pattern of the Ebola outbreak has changed. 2015 has seen a significant decline in the number of new Ebola cases in the 3 affected countries. Liberia, once the worst affected country with several hundred cases per week, has been steadily reporting fewer than 5 cases per week for the past month, all isolated to a single chain of transmission in one county. While overall figures remain much lower than what we saw in 2014, incidence rates rose again in Guinea and Sierra Leone in recent weeks. More than half of those newly infected have not been in contact with the people known to have had Ebola. This reminds us that setbacks can quickly follow apparent gains and highlights the need for constant vigilance and active surveillance, even in unaffected areas. Mesdames et Messieurs, notre action.
Ladies and gentlemen, your action will be complicated by the rainy season, which is imminent, during which other diseases will gain ground and some roads will become impracticable. With a view to better controlling the situation, the UN system through UNMEER is mobilizing surge efforts to support national and local authorities, and this is in Guinea and Sierra Leone. We are redoubling our efforts to reach the targets set by the presidents of the Mano River Union, and those targets were set on the 15th of February. 0 cases in 60 days by mid-April. A strong, effective response can indeed bring the spread of Ebola under control. However, if communities, governments, and partners cease to be vigilant, resort to unsafe practices, and fail to conduct active surveillance, and if donors decide not to finance this vital push, flare-ups will occur.
Too much progress has been made and too much is at stake to afford complacency. We must finish the job. Our collective efforts have made remarkable progress. We have succeeded in averting the worst-case scenarios we feared. There are encouraging signs that the worst of the outbreak is behind us. But much important work lies ahead until the affected countries reach 0 cases and begin the transition to reconstruction and recovery. I call on all responders to redouble their efforts and on donors to stay the course. Under the technical leadership of the World Health Organization, the UN system will continue supporting efforts to get to 0 through active surveillance, case management, and community engagement. The UN system will also contribute to the safe revival of essential services. As the situation improves, the time will come for critical functions to transition progressively and seamlessly from UNMIR to the UN agencies, funds, and programs. Significant additional resources will be required by the UN system. My special envoy, Dr. Navarro, will continue to mobilize the resources needed to fill critical gaps, including through my trust fund. The UN system will work with the national governments and regional partners to ensure that the investment made in the fight to stop Ebola serve as a basis for longer-term recovery effort. We must help the affected countries to become more resilient. Ebola must not be allowed to take hold again in the region. I appeal to you today to stay engaged and sustain this crucially important work. Let us provide the resources needed to get to 0. Let us ensure that reconstruction and recovery can occur without delay. And let us translate the lessons from this collective effort into building stronger national systems for health security. And lastly, I'd like to thank all member states for your strong support for UNMIR, led by Mr. Ismail Ould Sheikh Ahmed and his team, who have been working very hard, selflessly, on the very difficult and dangerous situation. And I also highly commend Dr. David Navarro, a special envoy, for his continuing support and vision to help our efforts to get to 0 cases and eliminate this Ebola. I count on your continuing support and leadership. Thank you very much. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
I thank the Secretary General for his statement. I now give the floor to Mr. Ismail Ould Sheikh Ahmed, Special Representative and Head of the United Nations Mission for Ebola Emergency Response, to brief the membership. Mr. Ould Sheikh Ahmed is joining us via video conference from Monrovia.
Your Excellency, Mr. Kutesa, President of the General Assembly, Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I am very pleased to be with you again today to update you on progress in the Ebola response 5 months since we welcomed the establishment of UNMIR. Since my briefing last month, there has been further considerable progress in the response. As the Secretary General noted, we have reason to believe that the worst of the outbreak is behind us. I am speaking to you today from Liberia, where progress has been particularly remarkable. The number of new cases per week has decreased from several hundred only a few months ago to a few than 5 cases per week for several consecutive weeks. On average, there has been less than 1 confirmed case per day in 2015, with cases in recent weeks all isolated to a single chain of transmission in Montserrado County. In view of such progress in Liberia, we are now pursuing the redeployment of some UNMIR resources and capabilities to bolster surge effort in Sierra Leone and especially in Guinea. In Sierra Leone and Guinea, we also saw an overall significant decline in the number of new cases in January. Since then, however, weekly cases incidence has increased, demonstrating that progress in fighting this outbreak will not be linear and that there is a need for constant vigilance to ensure sustained progress. In Guinea, the epicenter of the outbreak has shifted to Bas Guinea, adjacent to Conakry, while in Sierra Leone, incidents continue to be greatest in the western district of Port Loko and the capital, Freetown. In both countries, targeted efforts are being pursued to further reduce the number of cases as well as geographic dispersal and to strengthen active surveillance to ensure that new cases emanate from registered contact lists. But I take this opportunity to congratulate President Johnson Sirleaf, President Koroma, and President Conde for their leadership during this very difficult time of crisis where leadership is often very much challenged. Excellence, Monsieur le Président.
Your Excellencies, Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, while recognizing the progress that has been made in tackling the Ebola virus, we cannot, however, sit on our laurels. The impending rainy season means that we will have complicated challenges and will lead to an increase in the prevalence of other diseases such as malaria, which may mask suspected cases of Ebola. It may also mask the emergence of new cases of Ebola and significantly affect our capacity to access affected communities. These factors will compound the need to urgently control the epidemic in the next 12 weeks. The UN system through UNMIR is looking at the developments in the epidemic, and our epidemiologists are going to the more remote areas, and we are having a more flexible response, and we are further stressing rapid action to detect cases as early as possible and find a few cases in many areas. Against this backdrop, before the rainy season, we are redoubling our efforts to put people on the ground and to provide basic surveillance and to ensure that we can intervene in each district. And this means that we can quickly identify and isolate new cases and prevent a new outbreak. Over the long term, this reaction capacity can also be used to strengthen resilience in the health sectors in affected countries and pave the way for gradual transition of UNMIR in its immediate responses to the outbreak. Now, although we have made significant progress, we still have huge challenges with respect to active surveillance, case management, and the communities must be properly engaged in Guinea and Sierra Leone. First of all, there has been great success linked to changes at the community level, and wherever communities are involved, we have seen impressive results. However, denial, distrust, and the lack of understanding continue to create resistance in certain pockets and lead to dangerous practices that can probably promote further outbreaks. If we step up our efforts to mobilize communities through a more localized approach, we can probably win over the communities and facilitate access and build resilience. Even in unaffected areas, we must ensure that communities are involved so that we can actively provide surveillance and prevent further transition. In Guinea, the rise in new cases does not necessarily mean that there are more cases of transmission, but rather better action at the community level. I just came back from a 4-day mission in Guinea where I visited several areas, and the progress in Guinea Forestier show clearly that Guinea can overcome the major epidemic that we are seeing in Forikaya, Koya, and the Conakry belt. However, if we are to reach these ambitious targets, we must have major surge efforts in communities and support from international partners for the very committed government of President Condé. Secondly, the geographic scattering of cases of Ebola and the people in the districts, as well as the porous borders, makes it necessary for all districts to be equipped with surveillance equipment and intervention capacity so that they can prevent cases from spreading. We have laboratories and we can provide case management in affected areas, but we must ensure that we have sufficient geographic coverage of such capacities. Third, since the number of weekly cases is falling and we are trying to find affected persons to contain transmission, we must step up such efforts, and we must ensure that any new cases are registered so that there is no transmission chain. Efforts are underway to strengthen searches for contacts and to prevent the spread of the disease in all the districts where we have registered such cases. We're still facing problems in terms of mobility when it comes to accessing remote areas and to provide surveillance in those areas, and we're seeing this more difficult as the rainy season approaches.
Gentlemen, allow me to update you on support from our regional partners who continue to play an important role in our efforts. The Special Envoy and I were in Addis Ababa during the last African Union Summit held talks with our partners, including the chairperson of the African Union Commission, Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma. The chairperson convened a stakeholder conference on Ebola, which I joined her in co-chairing. The workshop was well received, and the support of the African Union, particularly through the contribution of over 800 health care workers from the African Union support to Ebola outbreak in West Africa, has been crucial. During a summit of the Mano River Union on 15 February in Conakry, Guinea, the President of Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone collectively validated the strategy framework step that the Special Envoy and WHO developed. UNMIR has been supporting the affected government to implement this strategic framework. The President has called on UNMIR and all partners to accelerate our efforts and support them to achieve zero Ebola infection within 60 days, effective 15 February 2015. Excellency, Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, UNMIR has also concurrently started planning for the time when national government and UN agency funds and programs no longer need our support. If the epidemiological situation shows that we have been successful in our surge effort over the next few months, then the time also draws near for us to begin a phased transition in which we will transfer UNMIR's function and capabilities to national government and UN partners. This transition must ensure a gradual, seamless, and coordinated process that UN country teams can continue to support the nationally led response effort and be based upon clearly defined thresholds in terms of both the epidemiological situation and existing national and partner capacity. Just as the outbreak and the response in each country has varied, so too must this transition be tailored to country and district-specific exigencies on the ground. Since the countries are in different phases of their response, UNMIR may also need to redeploy its capabilities to other countries where the outbreaks has not yet been brought under control. it is critical to transfer operation carefully through a planned and coordinated transition to consolidate the gains that we have collectively made and to leave no voids behind. As UNMIR scales down, the UN agency funds and program will scale up and support the affected countries in reaching 0 new cases of Ebola and then in re-establishing essential services and commencing reconstruction and recovery efforts. Important efforts are already well underway to support the safe reopening of non-Ebola health services, including through the decommissioning of some Ebola treatment units in Liberia, as well as the resumption of education services. As schools and universities reopen, it is important to acknowledge that there is a risk that some contact tracers, very often teachers and university students, as well as medical students currently engaged in managing Ebola response center, will return to their normal function, adversely affecting response activities. It will also be important to ensure that cash payment to Ebola response workers are not abruptly interrupted and that capacities, where possible, are reoriented to support the transition into reconstruction and recoveries. Excellency, Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, UNMIR's relevance comes from making ourselves irrelevant. The sooner we work ourselves out of the job, the better for the people of West Africa. For now, let us focus on this core work ahead. We must invest all our efforts and energy into surging the response and increasing impact through integrated surveillance, case management, and community engagement effort ahead of the rainy season, when seasonal epidemics of malaria and road closure will impede operations. The people of West Africa have never confronted Ebola on this scale before. In spite of this and the challenging conditions they faced, their efforts have stemmed the disease and prevented the worst-case scenario we all feared. I shared the objective of getting to 0 transmission that President Alpha Condé of Guinea, President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf of Liberia, President Ernest Bai Koroma of Sierra Leone have declared on 15th of February. In this regard, I reaffirm UNMIR and my commitment to the President that UNMIR will support them with their national and regional plan. We have important work ahead to reach this objective and to ensure that we have collectively put in place the systems, capacities, and mechanisms to sustain this progress so that these gains can be leveraged for longer-term reconstruction and recovery processes. I continue to be humbled by the task entrusted to me by the Secretary General in heading UNMIR, as well as by the resilience of the affected countries, the courage of national and international responders, the powerful mobilization of regional actors from the African Union to ECOWAS to the Manu River Union, and by the collective solidarity you have all demonstrated through your generous contribution. I congratulate His Excellency Mr. President Kutesa, President of the General Assembly, for his personal leadership and commitment to end this crisis. I ask you to continue to stand with us through this decisive period. Thank you very much.
I thank the Special Representative and Head of the United Nations Mission for Ebola Emergency Response for his briefing. I now give the floor to Dr. David Nabarro, Special Envoy of the Secretary General on Ebola, to brief the membership.
Your Excellency, Mr. Sam Kutesa, President of the General Assembly, and Mr. Secretary General, and Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to start my remarks by thanking you personally, Mr. President, for your commitment, your unfailing commitment to this really tricky issue, and thank you for convening this meeting today. Well, everybody, there are now 10 times fewer people diagnosed with Ebola each week than there were in September last year. And there really has been remarkable progress. Yet in preventing the final 10% of infections, about 120 or 30 per week, might be the hardest part of the response. And until this hard part, this last part, is completed, the affected nations and the world cannot declare victory. So I hope you will allow me to focus on 5 particular elements of what our President, the Secretary-General, and SRSG Ismail Ul-Sheikh Ahmed covered in the remarks that they made. Firstly, this idea of commitment. Ismail affirmed that UNMIR is committed to getting to zero. And I can assure you that the broad coalition of governments and their response partners, together with the agencies, funds and programs of the United Nations system, are fully behind the declaration of the Mana River Union Summit last Sunday to end Ebola in 60 days. They will work hard to coordinate support for an intensive, country-led and community-driven push to end this outbreak within the period. And we are building on the hard work of last year. All the beds that were set up for Ebola treatment, all the burial teams that have been hard at work, all the behaviour change that's been initiated. And now what we need to do is to ensure that there is the needed capability in each of the 63 prefectures, counties and districts in an area that's almost as big as the country France. And what have they got to do? They've got to ensure strong surveillance of the population. They've got to identify people with Ebola, to confirm the diagnosis, to quickly arrange effective treatment, to identify the people that are their contacts, and to keep those people under review for 21 days. This is a really difficult task. It's like detective work, but it's detective work where you're having to find a very small number of people in a big population. And it's difficult because people move around a lot in this region, sometimes very long distances. But I want to stress to you that identifying and tracing the people who are contacts is absolutely vital, because the only place where this virus survives for any length of time is inside living people. So if we find and we monitor every person who is a contact, we can find and stop every chain of transmission, and the outbreak can be ended quickly and definitively. And so that's why our ambition is to ensure that all people who are newly diagnosed with Ebola are known contacts of others who have been confirmed to have the disease. But we're not there yet. In recent weeks, the percentage of new cases who are known contacts has sometimes been quite low, 20 or 30%. And under those circumstances, it's not surprising that there have been unexpected flare-ups of disease in places that were thought to be Ebola-free. Now, it's not easy tracing contacts, but it tends to be more effective when communities themselves are fully engaged in the effort and when they're working in harmony with the responders. And that's why there's been extra emphasis on trying to find ways to engage even the most reticent of communities, and to do it in ways that leads to building trust. There's actually no other way to do this. Now to my second point. The UN systems and other partners require additional finance to support the work of national governments as they strive to get to zero. Now, none of us really like to sit in front of you and to beg for resources. But I think I have to stress to you that the tasks that we're doing now are actually costly. And that's why money is needed. The cost was assessed in January, and we presented it in the latest Outlook of Needs and Requirements for the UN system and partners, a document that was released in January this year. And we, of course, are very eager to share the document with you and to tell you where it is on the web. Because what we're saying is that if the intensive effort is to be sustained and has to be sustained for much of this year, the total cost will be about 1.5 billion. Now, we've got some money in the bank. We've got about 600 million, but it does leave quite a large shortfall in finance. And the agencies, funds and programs of the UN system and our partners therefore have to ask you for more. Now, as the Secretary-General said, we're rather proud of one of the mechanisms for financing the response. That's the trust fund that he established in September last year. It moves money quickly to those who are in need. And since it was set up, it's received really generous contributions from 31 nations and also one private sector group. And it's distributed $131 million in strategic support for the response, going for logistical systems, for survivors, for orphans, for payment of workers, for treatment, and indeed for prevention. This week, we're going to show you how transparent the operations of this fund have been. We will publish a report of what's been done with all the contributions. We'll explain that 90% of the contributed funds have been distributed, and we are going to request further contributions from governments and organisations who've not yet contributed, as well as replenishments from those who've already done so. My third comment, Mr. President, is to say how the people and the governments of the affected countries are now reviving basic services. They're getting government working again. Schooling is restarting, as many of you will know, because it's been widely reported. As we've heard from people who've spoken already, healthcare is starting again, and markets are reopening. It's not easy, because to revive these services when you've got an outbreak of Ebola underway is a dangerous thing to do. It's not easy for doctors and nurses to work if they're anxious that their patients might have Ebola. And that's why we're working very hard on ensuring the safe revival of services. And international responders, especially from within Africa, and particularly through the African Union's ASEWA initiative, are playing a vital role in this revival. And they continue to need strong support of member states. Our own United Nations Development Programme is convening a joint effort by the World Bank, the United Nations as a whole, the European Union, and the African Development Bank to support an Ebola recovery assessment. The UNDP Administrator, Helen Clark, is today in Freetown in Sierra Leone. And early this morning, she contacted me to send me the following 3 messages which I'd like to share with you. These are Helen's words. Stopping the outbreak continues to be top priority of the 3 governments and all partners. The last mile is never easy. The outbreak isn't over in all 3 countries until isn't over in any one country until it's over in all 3 countries. While the situation in, for example, Sierra Leone is not what it was in September, October, or November last year, nevertheless, it's still a major crisis because the deadly contagious disease is still moving around the country. Secondly, Helen says, big partnerships are needed to defeat the disease. Government leadership and international solidarity have been vital, but without community engagement and empowerment and behaviour change, the outbreak cannot be stopped. Community leaders and volunteers of all ages are playing a huge role. And Helen's third point, global solidarity for recovery is vital. To walk away when 0 cases has been achieved would be unconscionable. Essential services need to be rebuilt or built where they never existed. Livelihoods must be kick-started. The vulnerable, including widows, children, the elderly and the disabled, who've been so severely impacted, all need support. And the support will need to be sequenced from the short term to the medium and longer term, and should be framed in the context of national development plans. Now I go back to my fourth point. The UN mission for Ebola emergency response, as Ismail just said, will undergo a transition. Now, UNMIR was approved by this General Assembly in September as an innovative and short-term mechanism to deliver time-limited backup to the response. I've seen the real value that UNMIR is providing in support of national actions and in coordinating others who are involved in the response. I salute the leadership being provided by Ismail and his dedicated team. The UN contribution to the collective response will, though, progressively be transferred to the agency's funds and programs as they establish the capacity needed to help eliminate Ebola and revive basic services. A fifth point, Mr. President, you said that there will be a conference in Brussels on the 3rd of March. And this is going to be an important event to agree on the road to zero, to identify current gaps in the response, and to kickstart the recovery plan that Helen referred to. The conference will be co-chaired by the African Union, the presidents of Guinea, Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Togo, chair of ECOWAS. Also co-chairing is the European Union and the United Nations. This is going to be important, and it'll be followed by a meeting to focus on mobilizing resources for revival and recovery, to be hosted here in New York by our United Nations Secretary General at the end of May. And they're going to be linked together, these conferences, and I hope that they will pave the way for adequate support. Mr. President, I conclude with 2 observations and 1 final thought. Number 1, as we've said before in this Assembly, the outbreak will not be over until the last case has been traced and treated. The UN system will remain fully and responsibly engaged until this outbreak is ended and through the period of recovery. Number 2, we know that there will be further outbreaks of hemorrhagic fever and other dangerous diseases in the future in many parts of our world. Throughout this response, our system is focusing on ways to apply lessons from the present outbreak so that nations and regions can respond more rapidly and effectively to future threats. And now to my last thought. The people of this region in Western Africa have endured enormous suffering as a result of this outbreak. Now, all of us, when we work, have people we look to alongside us, who we see as our guides. And in our case, it's the people of West Africa who are alongside us as we do our work. We feel them guiding us as to what we must do. We feel them checking that we do what we do right. We feel them urging us to do more so that this cruel tragedy is promptly brought to an end. Every day we recommit to serving them as best we can. And we thank you in this General Assembly for giving us the political support and the means to do this vital task. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the Special Envoy of the Secretary General on Ebola for his briefing. I would now like to inform members that the Secretary General needs to leave for his time due to prior commitment. I now open the floor for comments or questions. In order to effectively use the presence of our distinguished guests, may I request the delegations to make their statements as concise as possible and not longer than 3 minutes. I thank you for your cooperation. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Guinea.
Monsieur le Président,
President, first of all, I'd like to thank you for taking this initiative to organize this meeting following the publication of the Secretary-General's report on UNMIR's activities and the evolution of the Ebola response. This is an opportunity for my delegation once again to thank the Secretary-General for the information and relevant conclusions contained in his report and for all the endeavors which UNMIR continues to make in combating Ebola on the ground. We'd also like to thank the special representative and head of UNMIR, Mr. Ismail Sheikh Ahmed, and Mr. Dr. Nabarro, the special envoy, for their unstinting commitment and for the briefing they've just provided us with. This is the right place for my government to express its profound gratitude on behalf of our people as well to the African Union for mobilizing African states through the deployment of healthcare workers from Africa in the field and for their advocacy efforts to help the country suffering from Ebola. We also thank all the partners who are in the vanguard alongside us for all their sacrifices in helping us to find a way out of this extremely difficult and unprecedented ordeal. The care workers comprising African and non-African nationals are the real heroes of this fight against the Ebola virus. And here they should receive our profound gratitude for their enormous solidarity. President, the report submitted to us is very heartening in the light of the substantial and promising progress made in the response. We share the cautious optimism expressed therein. The work is not yet finished. Many challenges still have to be met, and as the special representative of the SG and the head of the mission have clearly stated, it's a complex struggle which still remains to be waged. In Guinea, we remain concerned that the epicenter has shifted from one region to another. It's now Basse-Guinée, which is the closest district to the capital. And as rightly pointed out in the Secretary-General's report, this requires sustained bolstering of rapid response capacity insofar as the people affected by Ebola, although they're relatively few in number, are scattered across the country, thus complicating the surveillance and case management efforts and breaking the transmission chain. And above all, they run the risk of a resurgence and more outbreaks. Moreover, there are cases of resistance and often violent actions against caregivers, notwithstanding the public awareness campaign of the government. The spread of inaccurate information regarding the epidemic continues. President, as the Secretary-General has warned us in his report, we are rapidly moving towards the rainy season. This season is especially difficult for mobility, and it will complicate further the response activities in the region. And that is why my delegation is grateful for the approach taken by the Secretary-General, which involves placing greater emphasis on substantially increasing UNMIR staff in this critical phase, as well as the principle of redeploying them in the countries or regions where the needs are most keenly felt, insofar as progress, albeit major, varies from one country to another and from one place to another within the same country. we cannot place enough emphasis on the fact that we need to step up our efforts if we wish to eradicate this epidemic completely prior to the advent of the rainy season. The heads of state and government of the Mano River Union, for their part, held an extraordinary summit on the 15th of January in order to harmonize the various response systems, and this is prior to the Brussels conference on the 3rd of March. Insofar as the Ebola epidemic can only be vanquished if each country manages completely to eradicate the virus, the heads of state agreed that they would adopt a global response campaign valid for all 3 countries. This plan seeks to bring about zero infection within 60 days. In the Mano River Union, as of the 15th of February, there will be a strategy for prevention, social mobilization campaigns, commitment, surveillance, and cross-border cooperation, all brought into play. And while acknowledging the efforts of the states and the international community that have brought about the drop in Ebola infection cases, the heads of state pleaded vis-à-vis their international partners that there be proper planning and management of their departure in a responsible manner. Their departure should be driven by epidemiology while guaranteeing appropriate transfer of skills to the national institutions, while holding regular information exchanges among the nations at all levels. President, as regards the socioeconomic consequences, the devastating consequences in this area of the Ebola virus, the heads of state on the 15th of February also decided to adopt a global response valid for all the countries. This covers issues which affect almost all the key development sectors: health, education, agriculture, industry, trade, as well as social action, placing emphasis on the issue of taking care of the orphans and particularly stricken families. So the heads of state are counting on the understanding of bilateral and multilateral partners to provide the requisite support for implementing this global plan for economic recovery, not only in the short term, but also in the medium and longer term, including through budgetary support and the write-off of debt for the countries concerned. President, my delegation urges the international community to maintain this essential global approach, not only completely to eradicate Ebola, but also to ensure that there is effective and lasting economic recovery in the countries affected by Ebola. A selective and piecemeal approach will never succeed in eradicating this epidemic. To conclude, President, my delegation would like to express the fullest gratitude of the government of the people of Guinea to all the partners for this tremendous mobilization and their solidarity vis-à-vis the populations severely stricken by the Ebola epidemic. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Guinea. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Liberia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, SRSG Ahmed, Special Envoy Nabarro, Madam Chef de Cabinet, Excellencies, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Once again, Mr. President, we extend appreciation to you for convening this briefing section aimed at keeping the membership of the Assembly abreast of developments in the global response to the Ebola virus disease. The enemy which so abruptly and rudely interrupted the efforts of 3 poor countries in West Africa to consolidate peace and accelerate development for the betterment of their people. In Liberia, we had embarked confidently on implementation of an agenda for transformation with infrastructure development, in particular energy and roads, at its core. The attack of the Ebola virus was so invasive, affecting every sector, eating at the very fiber of our society, and demanding the exclusive focus of our entire country, and indeed attention of the international community. We watched as this destructive disease evolved, devouring in its wake the promising lives of hundreds and then thousands of Liberians until a global force was mounted against it. These were the early days of the Ebola pandemic. Today, the Secretary General's comprehensive report and the insightful briefings provided by the SRSG and Dr. Nabarro gave us a good sense of where we are and how far we have traveled together on the journey towards eradication of this deadly virus. I thank the Secretary General for a very forward-looking report, which is already foreseeing the desired seamless transition from UNMIR to the UN agencies, funds, and programs, and our distinguished briefers for the information which they have shared with us today. There has been significant progress, no doubt, of which we can all be proud, but it has been uneven progress, and none of the countries has achieved the goal of eradication of the Ebola virus. This underscores the need for continued solidarity and partnership. Our achievements can be attributed to a dynamic combination of factors, including strong and committed national leadership, community engagement and ownership, resilient people, and steadfast international support. Moving forward, we will need the same coalition of actors to win the war against the Ebola virus. On behalf of the President of Liberia, Mrs. Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the people and government of Liberia, I extend deep gratitude to all of the governments, the African Union and other regional and international organizations, including the international financial institutions, staff who have been on the front lines, the private sector, and philanthropists who contributed in a variety of ways to the progress made so far in Liberia. I reserve a special thanks for the Secretary General for his countless initiatives, the most recent being the launching of the Ebola Recovery Assessment. We commend you, Mr. President, and the presidents and chairs of the other UN bodies, such as ECOSOC and the Peace Building Commission, for keeping the Ebola global response on your respective agendas and making efforts in galvanizing international support, as well as the leadership and staff of UNMIR and UN agencies, funds, and programs who are supporting the implementation of national programs. I join the Secretary General's appeal for continued engagement of member states and the larger international community, including through additional financial contribution, to enable us to successfully complete the final phase of the campaign against the Ebola virus. Mr. President, it is a source of great encouragement that Liberia has progressed from a situation of 100 cases per week to 4 or 5 per week. We realize, however, that complacency is indeed an enemy, second only to the virus itself. My government, therefore, remains focused on bringing the rate of infection to 0, giving Liberia a strong belief in regional collaboration as an important dimension of the Ebola response. President Sirleaf has joined her colleagues of Guinea and Sierra Leone in a common commitment made at an extraordinary summit of the Mana River Union 3 days ago to reach the 0 infection milestone within 60 days from 15 February, according to the strategy already explained by my colleague, the Ambassador of Guinea. Liberia's strategy for achieving this goal includes continued focus on decentralization, which involves the establishment of treatment units and facilities in its 15 counties so as to ensure adequate coverage of the various geographical areas of the country. These facilities and the technical capacity are necessary to do the case identification, contact tracing, and treatment, which Dr. Nabarro has spoken about so well already. WHO is a valued partner in this effort on health standards, while UNMIR is supporting this process through the deployment of staff to the country and district levels. The decommissioning of redundant Ebola centers is facilitating the reactivation of essential non-Ebola health services. Several non-Ebola healthcare centers have now reopened, and government is exploring the possible reassignment of foreign medical teams to support the restoration of health services at county and district levels. For partners who cannot prolong their presence, the government is urging that they disengage responsibly so as not to have a negative impact on the progress on the ground. Acting within the scope of their respective mandates, the UN agencies are also providing vital support to the restoration of services in various sectors, in particular the health and education sectors. UNICEF is providing valuable support to enable the safe reopening of schools, which occurred yesterday, 17 February. We are very encouraged also by the social protection programs which have been put in place by the agencies, UNDP, UNICEF, UNFPA, to provide psychosocial support, assistance to the over 3,000 orphan children, cash transfers, and emergency stipends to needy families, with special attention to women and children who have been disproportionately affected by the virus. We join the Secretary General's call for even more coordinated action by the agencies and all partners to consolidate and not compromise progress on the ground. In parallel with these programs, the government has also initiated planning for early recovery. The government was pleased to receive the visit of the multi-partner Ebola recovery assessment team in Monrovia in January. And with UNDP's support, the government is finalizing its economic stabilization and recovery plan. There are high expectations for positive outcomes from the discussions on stabilization and recovery of the economies of the affected countries, which are being planned to take place in Brussels, as Dr. Nabarro has already said, and subsequently in May here in New York. Finally, Mr. President, we are gratified by the reassurance given in the Secretary General's report that his special envoy will continue efforts to galvanize political and financial support, because all of the efforts and strategies to reach zero infection and to address the socio-economic effects of the Ebola virus disease require resources and resources and resources. We retain our optimism that the international community will remain engaged in this global effort until the war against the virus is won. I thank you for your attention.
I thank the distinguished representative of Liberia. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Sierra Leone.
First of all, Mr. President, let me take this opportunity to express the profound gratitude and appreciation of my government for the attention that you have given to the Ebola virus disease in the sub-region. You have devoted so much time and energy during your tenure to ensure that we attain success in the fight against Ebola. Let me also take this opportunity, Mr. President, to thank the Secretary General, who has taken time off his busy schedule this morning to be with us. And also let me thank very much Dr. Nabarro, Special Envoy of the Secretary General on the Ebola, for the wonderful manner in which the multi-partner trust fund has been managed, and the timely manner in which funds have been allocated to all the projects in the 3 countries. Mr. President, permit me also to thank Mr. Ismail Ul-Sheikh Ahmed, Special Representative and Head of the United Nations Mission for Ebola Emergency Response, for his very insightful briefing this morning. Mr. President, let me express profound appreciation to all our development partners, in particular the frontline workers and the UN family, for for their invaluable support in our fight to combat and eradicate the Ebola virus disease in our sub-region. I would also like to thank the Secretary General for his letter of 10th February of 2015 addressed to you, the President, which highlighted progress made by UNMIA thus far. Mr. President, there is no doubt that due to the collective efforts of government and our development partners, especially in the deployment of medical supplies, personnel, financial resources, and necessary infrastructure that have been put in place, we have made tremendous gains in the fight against the Ebola virus disease. In general, the infection rate has been remarkably reduced. We are optimistic that we are on the right track to bring to an end this terrible disease. As of February 17, there were only 4 new confirmed cases in the entire country. We are also encouraged by the impressive number of survived and discharged cases, which stood at 2,847 as of that same date. Mr. President, all of this is due largely to the community mobilization campaign that was launched by His Excellency the President of Sierra Leone, in which the community, the local communities, were fully involved in all the exercise to combat the disease. Mr. President, the Ebola disease, as we all know, has caused unprecedented social and humanitarian damage accompanied by severe economic consequences. It has negatively impacted the impressive gains made in our economic growth in recent years. Important economic activities, including agriculture, mining, manufacturing, construction, trade and commerce, transport and tourism, have been disrupted, with the attendant consequences of high rates of national unemployment. Since the outbreak of the disease, over 6,000 Sierra Leoneans have been infected to date, and over 3,000 have died. Our doctors and nurses are among the victims. Over 11 of our senior medical doctors and many more nurses have fallen victims to the virus, with serious consequences of further widening the ratio of doctors to the population. Children have been orphaned and women have been widowed by the disease. Schools have remained closed, and over 2/3 of those infected are in the economically active age group. Furthermore, the epidemic has crowded out effective response to other diseases in the national healthcare system, and as a result, non-Ebola illnesses have added to the suffering of our people. Mr. President, we are confronted with complex post-Ebola challenges that require strategic planning. As a way forward, government, in collaboration with partners, is developing a comprehensive post-Ebola recovery strategy. The first draft of this strategy is already out and is being discussed by all stakeholders at the national level. This recovery strategy is guided and inspired by the conviction that while we have been negatively challenged by the Ebola epidemic, there are great opportunities we must not waste time to seize. We shall continue to work closely with the Joint Ebola Recovery Assessment Team, headed by the UNDP, that has already made visits to the 3 most affected countries. We thank the Secretary General for this initiative. We look forward to the continued support of our development partners for a successful implementation of our national recovery strategy. And we are hopeful that the upcoming Brussels meeting, scheduled for the 3rd of March this year, will meet the high expectations of the affected countries. Mr. President, as a result of the progress made in the fight against Ebola, government has announced various measures, which include, among others, the easing of restriction on movement of people in order to gradually reactivate economic activities. 2, design a school reopening program that will ensure the following actions: disinfection of institutions used as holding and/or treatment centers, as well as those institutions identified as having accommodated Ebola victims, satisfactory water and sanitation facilities at schools, provision of educational institution with thermal sensors, training of teachers on Ebola safety protocols, incentives to get pupils to school, such as school feeding programs, supplementing teaching and learning for schools at all levels through broadcast programs, supplementing teaching and learning for schools at all levels through broadcast programs, and making special provisions for education of girls who became pregnant during the Ebola period and are unable to return to school. The target date for the reopening of educational institutions is 30th of March. Mr. President, although we are beginning to see cases in single digits, we must not fall into the temptation of lowering our guard. We must sustain the fight until we are able to attain 0 cases in the entire country. Similarly, we want to appeal to all our partners in this struggle to regard the 3 most affected countries as a single constituency, so that the rate of success is made uniform in all 3 countries. A 0 case in 1 or 2 of these countries should not be regarded as a conclusive success, because it will only take 1 infected person to reverse any gains that may have been made. Mr. President, I will not conclude without emphasizing the point that as our development partners, as our partners who have been with us in this struggle so far, as they prepare to fold up, emphasis should be made in developing national capacities, particularly our medical institutions, because one of the reasons why the disease got out of hand in the first place was because the 3 most affected countries, particularly my country, Sierra Leone, lacked the capacity, and we were quite unprepared to face the disease when it broke out. Therefore, emphasis should be made to ensure that the capacity of our institutions is enhanced, so that the resilience of these institutions is made possible for any future outbreaks that may occur. I thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of Sierra Leone. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the European Union.
Thank you, Mr. President, and warm thanks to you, to Mr. Ismail Old Sheikh Ahmed, and also to Mr. David Nabarro for their interventions. Ebola rightly remains high on our agendas, as witnessed by no fewer than 3 briefings organized in New York this week. We strongly agree that international attention must remain seized by the fight against Ebola. While huge progress has been made in the fight, thanks to the colossal efforts of the affected countries with the support of the international community, we must maintain a concerted push to isolate and treat every case and trace every contact. Ebola will only be defeated once case numbers are down to 0 in each of the affected countries. 1 single case is enough to derail our collective effort. As you know, the European Union is doing its part with over 1.2 billion euros provided so far in assistance, with medical teams, laboratories, and epidemiologists on the ground, with massive support to the development of an effective vaccine. On 3 March 2015, together with Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone, the African Union, ECOWAS, and the United Nations were organizing a major international conference on Ebola in Brussels. This conference will bring us together to make sure we're all doing everything we can to bring cases down to 0 and to provide an opportunity to showcase recovery strategies and examine the recovery needs across sectors, such as health and education, governance, infrastructure and economic development, as well as the principles for engagement in that recovery. The conference will be an opportunity to present the main findings of the Ebola recovery assessment, a collective analysis guided by the affected countries and undertaken jointly between the World Bank, UNDP, African Development Bank, and the European Union. Now, the one question that I would have is how could a possible external assessment of the Ebola response, as is being called for by some member states, best complement the internal assessments as will be undertaken by each UN agency and of the UN response as a whole? Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the European Union. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Germany.
Thank you, Mr. President. Germany would like to align itself with the statement just given by the European Union, but has asked for the floor because we have a particular initiative that we would like to introduce, an African-European initiative, to which I will come in just a moment. But first, let me also thank Mr. Oldchik Ahmed and Mr. Nabarro and colleagues in the room for your sobering overview on current developments in Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone, and on the efforts of UNMEER. There is no doubt that all efforts must be focused on containing the recent upswing of infections. Are there specific gaps in capacities which might have contributed to the increase in the new infections? I think this question needs to be asked. As you know, Mr. President, Germany has been actively supporting the international efforts to fight Ebola from the beginning. We have seen that the road to zero is bumpy. This has led us to increase our bilateral financial contributions to the international Ebola response by another 33 million euro recently. And of course, we continue contributing to the significant assistance given by the European Union. And we will continue our national and European support and engagement in 2015. While remaining focused on the task in front of us to get Ebola cases to zero and support the epidemic's victims, we must also start the process of drawing lessons from the current efforts in order to prepare for future challenges. Our response to this crisis has disclosed weaknesses both in global healthcare structures and in the international crisis management system as a whole. Against this background, and I now come to the initiative that I would like to share with this panel. Against this background, Germany, Norway, and the Republic of Ghana have proposed to the Secretary General to set up a high-level panel of renowned personalities and to commission a report that, by drawing on lessons learned in our current efforts, outlines ways to reform international governance structures to steer and to coordinate a timely response in case of future outbreaks of deadly diseases or epidemics. This initiative is meant to complement evaluations already underway within relevant UN agencies and international organizations, of which we are aware and which we appreciate. But we believe that in addition to individual evaluations, a more comprehensive and coherent approach is warranted in order to effect concrete improvements. Our hope is that by developing concrete recommendations, the panel would guide UN member states in reforming existing mechanisms to ensure an improved response in case of similar crises in the future. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Germany. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Sweden.
Thank you, Mr. President. And Sweden also aligns itself with the statement just made by the European Union, but we would like to add some additional points. But first, let me thank you, Mr. President, for this very timely briefing. Our thanks also go to the Secretary General for his recent comprehensive report and briefing today, as well as to the head of UNMEER, Mr. Oldchik Ahmed, and of course to Dr. Nabarro for his briefing and for his tireless efforts. It is indeed encouraging to hear that the number of new cases of Ebola continues to decrease, especially in Liberia. On the other hand, we have to stay vigilant and we have to keep up the pressure until there are zero new cases. As stated in the Secretary General's report, targeted efforts are still required. The collective efforts of national governments and local communities, supported by the international community, have indeed avoided the worst-case scenarios. But the epidemic is far from being over. Sweden has so far contributed to the fight against Ebola with approximately $73 million US dollars. We remain active in the efforts to finally beat Ebola, also through health workers and experts on the ground. Mr. President, while we discuss the acute fight against Ebola, it's crucial that we also ensure a medium to long-term perspective. We certainly look forward to the Ebola recovery assessment that is underway. In addition to important aspects of recovery, such as a robust health systems, infrastructure, and economic recovery, peace building is a key aspect in this assessment. In the post-Ebola period, we must ensure that peace-building gains of the affected countries are not reversed, but rather that efforts in this area are accelerated. Sweden will certainly do its best to contribute to this, both in our role as chair of the PBC Liberia country-specific configuration and also in our incoming role as chair of the Peace Building Commission at large. Mr. President, in August last year, Sweden and the other chairs of the Peace Building Commission country configuration sounded the alarm bells about what was happening in the affected countries. Still, the international reaction came rather late, and there are certainly lessons to be learned from this by the international community. We therefore welcome the different evaluation processes that are ongoing and look forward to their conclusions. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Sweden. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President, for convening this important meeting. I would also like to thank the Secretary General for his remarks and the distinguished briefers for their wise words this morning. We thank the governments of Liberia, Guinea, and Sierra Leone, and all of their partners for the tremendous, dedicated, and fruitful efforts which are a shining example of how together we can confront major global challenges. Support for the long-term stability of the affected countries is vital to the region, the continent, and the world. Mr. President, we remain cautiously optimistic that the international community and the affected countries remain on course to end the outbreak. At the same time, we believe that the moment is ripe to begin the next phase of the UN's response to Ebola, transitioning UNMIR, which was created as a short-term solution to combat the virus until the UN system was better equipped to respond to the rapid transmission of this disease. Transition planning and preparations must begin now in order to complement the surge planning taking place for the impending rainy season, when we know diseases such as malaria will compound the situation. While progress continues to be achieved, significant challenges still stand in our path to success. Some communities remain reticent, and adequate surveillance and response capacities are not yet fully in place. We are especially concerned by recent reports citing lack of links between patients and contact tracing lists, as mentioned by Dr. Nabarro, as well as attacks against healthcare workers. It is incumbent upon all of us to maintain our sense of urgency and not allow a seat at the table to complacency. This is a theme that must be highlighted in our public messaging. Mr. President, as you may be aware, my government has begun to transition its presence in the region. This transition in no way indicates a lessening of U.S. support and attention to ending the outbreak and rebuilding the affected countries. President Obama has been adamant about this. We will get to 0 cases. We also should draw from the lessons learned from this effort so that the next time the world is faced with a complex medical humanitarian crisis, the UN architecture and international community at large is better prepared. To that end, the United States supports the UN's internal review of the response and the lessons learned effort requested by Germany, Norway, and Ghana. We also are encouraged by the recovery planning underway, including the early recovery assessment findings, and we look forward to being a part of the upcoming discussions regarding how we together can meaningfully regain development ground lost as a result of this virus. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United States. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to begin by expressing my sincere appreciation for your initiative in convening today's timely briefing on Ebola. I also would like to thank the Secretary General, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, SRSG, Mr. Ahmed, and Special Envoy Dr. Navarro for their comprehensive and informative briefings on the present situation of Ebola virus in West Africa. We are encouraged by the remarkable progress so far made, but I understand that the main thrust of the messages from the briefings is that international community should keep vigilant and responsive, and that donors should stay the course to show solidarity and partnerships. Mr. President, I would like to touch upon the efforts by Japan. The Japanese Diet 2 weeks ago approved the allocation of an additional $100 million, which we pledged last November. This additional contribution of $100 million includes funds for WHO and UNICEF for the treatment of infected individuals and UNFPA for safe child delivery for women. In addition, contributions to the UNDP and the World Bank will be used to rebuild health systems and stabilize societies of the affected countries. In this connection, Japan is very pleased to hear that the other donor countries are disbursing funds steadily. The medical drug the Japanese pharmaceutical industry has developed is reported to have shown to be effective in limited clinical trials in Guinea. Japan strongly hopes that this drug will contribute to the treatment of Ebola patients after its safety and efficacy are scientifically proven. Mr. President, I appreciate the dedicated work of AMIR and the leadership of the Special Envoy in coordinating all the UN agencies in this emergency situation. And as in the letter from the Secretary General, AMIR should begin to phase out at the appropriate time so other UN organizations can take over AMIR's function in a timely, seamless, and coordinated manner. But before passing on the responsibilities, AMIR should demonstrate a clear strategy with accountability towards achieving zero patients, which at present time still remains unclear. In addition, I would like to thank the distinguished delegate of Germany for the explanation on their initiative with the Norway and Ghana. Japan is very interested in this initiative, and I understand that the second observations that Dr. Navarro explained to us has something common with this initiative. In closing, I join the other speakers in expressing our hope that we will be able to achieve the zero target, and I would like to reiterate Japan's determination to continue to play an active role in combating this global threat. I thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Japan. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you for convening this meeting, which is extremely helpful. Thank you, of course, to the Secretary General for his remarks, and I'd also like to thank the Special Representative, Mr. Ahmed, and Special Envoy, Dr. Navarro, for their briefings, and more broadly, the United Kingdom would like to pay tribute to their work and the leadership they are demonstrating in the response to Ebola. Mr. President, it's of course good news that the heroic efforts of the people and governments of the affected countries, with support from international partners, are turning the tide of the battle against the scourge of Ebola. But the recent spikes in reported cases remind us of a need for continued vigilance. We have to guard against complacency, and the focus must remain on getting to 0 cases. Planning for recovery is important, but must not distract from this immediate priority. As rates of infection decline, the nature and needs of the response are shifting, but the challenges are not decreasing. We very much endorse the approach set out by the Special Representative and Special Envoy in the push to 0 cases. Increased surveillance, active case finding and management, rigorous contact tracing, and social mobilization are all essential. Dr. Nabarro spoke of commitment, so I should say that the UK remains committed to staying the course, particularly in Sierra Leone, where we have been contributing to support for the government's efforts. As the United Kingdom, we've committed a package of support which is worth somewhere around £325 million, or about $500 million, including the deployment of hundreds of personnel from our National Health Service and our military. We'll continue to work alongside the government and other international partners to defeat the outbreak, to hunt the disease down at district level, and to continue our support to the nationally coordinated effort. We agree with others who said that this last mile on the road to 0 will be a bumpy one, and it will be vital that the United Nations has the necessary high-quality human resource and leadership on the ground to help ensure 0 is reached. Looking ahead, Mr. President, the UK sees 3 key challenges. First, as I've said, maintaining the political focus and flow of resources necessary to get to 0. Secondly, planning and delivering a seamless and coordinated transition. And 3, achieving a safe, early and also long-term recovery. Let me say a couple of things on the transition and recovery, if I may. The countries affected by the crisis, with support from the United Nations, the World Bank, the European Union, the African Union and other partners, have a crucial opportunity ahead to develop and deliver a coordinated vision for recovery, starting with the Brussels conference on the 3rd of March. We look forward to seeing the Ebola recovery assessments identify clear, achievable priorities for recovery, and we hope these priorities will support the governments in the region in establishing new ways of working with their citizens and with donors as well, of course, to focus on transparency and accountability in order to strengthen systems and capacities. The international community should support a recovery that builds resilience to ensure this crisis never happens again. Mr. President, the United Nations will have a role in that recovery, an important role. There will need to be strong UN leadership in country to help ensure that plans for transition and recovery are delivered effectively. As UNMIR phases out, the UK believes it will be essential that UN agencies and country teams are ready to deliver both residual work on the response and on recovery, in line with their comparative advantages and the needs in their respective countries. Joint planning and collaborative working with the governments of the region and other partners will be essential to ensure that the move to transition and recovery is done in a safe manner and in no way jeopardizes the ongoing effort to eradicate the disease. So, in conclusion, Mr. President, we must get to 0 cases, and we need continued effort and vigilance to achieve that, and the UK is fully committed to that struggle. At the same time, we must turn the devastation this disease has wrought into an opportunity, first in the countries concerned, to build greater resilience, a strong economic recovery, and more effective institutions. And secondly, as others have said, internationally, we must learn the lessons to ensure that we are better equipped to respond to future international health crises, so that the tragic history we've seen play out in West Africa does not repeat itself either in the region or elsewhere. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of India.
Mr. President, we thank you for convening this very useful briefing. It is reassuring to hear of progress made in stabilizing the situation and in containing the epidemic caused by the Ebola crisis. The success is due to efforts of the national governments and also international cooperation. When we talk of international cooperation, one needs to underline the very important role played by the United Nations. However, as the Secretary General had noted, one cannot rule out possible setbacks. There is therefore a need do not let down our vigilance. Donors also need to stay the course. There is, in fact, little scope for complacency. We are happy to hear what Special Envoy David Nabarro has said about the multi-partner trust fund and its ability to move money quickly. India is happy to have contributed $10 million to the fund. We are one of the principal contributors. This is in addition to the contributions we have made bilaterally and through the WHO, both financially and in kind. We would like to take this opportunity to assure Mr. Ismail Sheikh Ahmed, head of UNMIR, and the United Nations that India will continue to support the efforts of the organization to address this threat. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of India. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of France.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, President. President, Your Excellencies, first of all, I'd like to thank you for organizing this meeting, which is coming at just the right time for us to take stock of the international community's response to the Ebola virus epidemic. There's a major drop in cases, but there are still pockets of the epidemic. And while we haven't reached zero infection, we need to be very vigilant and mobilized against this epidemic. The fight against it will remain one of our paramount priorities until then. President, the epidemiological results in your report are encouraging, with a major decline in infection in January. Nonetheless, new cases were recorded over the last few weeks, scattered among many communities, particularly in the border areas. These areas are the ones most difficult to reach, as we all know, and it shows that our vigilance must remain at the highest level. In order to adapt to this context, our response needs to be as flexible as possible. As you've all recalled, the rainy season is approaching with the risk of an upsurge in contaminations and other diseases such as malaria, which may mask other cases of Ebola, and we need to monitor the situation as closely as possible to ensure people do not recontaminate people with Ebola. The most remote regions must continue to be monitored so that we can track new cases and properly treat all detected cases. That has to be the priority of the international community. Mr. Nabarro, you stress the importance of equipping all districts, indeed, with contact tracers and laboratories. That is a key factor in monitoring the last 10% of cases, which must be overcome if we're to attain our goals. So France, as you know, has always placed its response to this epidemic as one of its highest priorities. And it has committed more than 150 million euros with treatment centres and our healthcare workers working on the ground. Our action plan has covered all the aspects of the response, and we're determined to tailor our response to the way in which the crisis evolves, as you've described it today, in particular through the Scientific Institute for Medical Research, INSERM. France has resolutely pledged to develop antiviral drugs with the most state-of-the-art clinical work to combat this epidemic in close cooperation with the Guinean authorities, but also the Japanese pharmaceutical laboratory, which lies behind this treatment. The results of the tests will be known very soon, and they should give us hope for combating this very dangerous epidemic. At the same time, we need to build for the future and bring about the recovery of the countries affected. Building the future means ensuring that the populations have access to essential services, as you all mentioned, such as water, education, restoration of economic flows, which is so important on a day-to-day basis of the populations, and ensure the states can reconstruct and can prevent a recurrence in future. We also therefore need to welcome the gradual reopening of the schools with rote learning of good behavior to avoid contamination and to deal with the disease. France is particularly proactive in ensuring that the next major encounters are a success, such as the Brussels meeting. This will allow us to build strong synergy to combat the epidemic and deal with the post-Ebola situation. May I take this opportunity, President, to make some comments and ask some questions for the benefit of the Special Representative and the Special Envoy? You adduced some information regarding redeployment of the UN response towards certain funds and programs. Could you give us some clarification on this? And also, could you give us some ideas regarding the modus operandi according to which this transfer of staff would take place? Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of France. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of China.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to sincerely thank you for convening this meeting. I thank Secretary General Ban Ki-moon for his statement, Romero and Mohammed, and for their briefing. We are happy to see, under the leadership of the United Nations and with the joint efforts of the international community, the spread of the Ebola has, in general, been eased, and we have a milestone in our success. Since the outbreak of the Ebola, China has provided 4 batches in a total value of $4 billion. We have sent 700 men-time in our medical teams to the affected countries. China's assistance is playing an essential role. Our medical workers have received more than 600 cases of Ebola. That is the longest and largest in scale, and also the greatest in efforts in China's medical teams in assisting other countries in the history. That reflects China has its sincerity to getting along and working with the African countries. The next stage, the international community should equally pay attention to achieving the economic recovery while combating the Ebola disease, and scale up the efforts in financial, human, and material assistance. I would like to reiterate here, as long as the Ebola case exists, China will not cease its assistance to Africa. China will continue to support the United Nations in playing a leading and coordinating role in this matter. I would like to work with the international community and other parties to overcome the Ebola and win an ultimate victory. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of China. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Cuba.
Thank you, President. Cuba hails your initiative, President, to convene this meeting, and it expresses gratitude for the presentations given by the Secretary General, by Dr. Navarro and Mr. Ismail. We feel that this invitation to the meeting is very timely in order to assess the situation in combating Ebola, Cuba restates its conviction that coordination by the United Nations and the guiding role of the WHO are essential to ensure there is a collective response which is effective. President, while the global response to the Ebola outbreak has given rise to some improvements in the situation, we cannot be complacent. We need to continue to combat a major public health emergency with grave economic, social, and humanitarian consequences, especially for the African continent and the countries most afflicted. We restate the paramount need for human, material, and financial resources in order to combat Ebola, but there's also a need for fresh, additional, unconditional resources for the development of Africa, well beyond this current situation, respecting the priorities identified by the African countries and their regional organizations, as well as the sub-regional organizations. Cuba would like to restate its tribute to Jorge Juan Guerrero Rodriguez and Reinaldo Fria Francantigua, two of the members of the Cuban Solidarity contingency in West Africa who gave their lives to combat Ebola. And at the same time, we take pride in the return of Dr. Felix Baez to Sierra Leone after being cured of Ebola. Cuba will continue to save lives, and its more than 250 staff will remain in the field. Thousands of Cubans, doctors and nurses, giving their cooperation in countries not affected by the epidemic in Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean, continue to develop prevention programs, supporting the national and local authorities in strengthening the preparation and response of the communities to outbreaks of this kind. I repeat our conviction that it is only through a collective response with the contribution of all countries, especially those that have the greatest resources, that we'll be able successfully to tackle this grave challenge. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Cuba. I thank representatives for their interventions. I now give the floor to the Chef de Cabinet, Susan Marcoya, to answer one or two questions.
Thank you, Mr. President, and good afternoon to everybody. Since it's the first time I take the floor, it's a really significant discussion, the one we have had this morning, and it shows that the collective work has results, but also requires continuous engagement. The question raised by the distinguished representative of France regarding the plans for the transition that were referred to in the Secretary General's letter and in all the interventions by the people who spoke earlier today, is something that we are planning on detail at this very moment. It's clear that there is no intention to leave in any shape or form a vacuum as we plan the transition, and that's precisely the reason why, while we are absolutely focused in the short term to the surge that is required before the rainy season, and there is no bigger priority for the mission and all the agency funds and programs, we are starting to work on the next phase because that requires resources, both human resources and financial resources, to ensure that this relay race in which UNMER will be transferring capabilities and responsibilities to the different agencies and programs is done without a single problem. None of this can be set in stone on a certain timeline because there has to be triggers, there has to be benchmarks established that ensure that the seamless process is well done. So we will continue to work on this. I'm sure as we report to you next month, we will have more details. And of course, as we all know, we're also constructing the budgetary support for all this work, and a lot of detailed work is being done as we speak. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the Chief of the Cabinet. I now give the floor to Mr. Ismail Old Sheikh Ahmed, Special Representative of the Head of the United Nations Mission to Ebola Emergency Response, to respond to any questions and issues raised by Member States.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I don't think I have much to add to what the Chief of the Cabinet has just clarified, because the question were related mainly to the issue of the transition phase and the accountability in regard to that. I think the Chief of the Cabinet has clarified that there will be a seamless transition to ensure that the capacity are in place. And I don't have much to add to that. Therefore, I would like simply to thank you again for convening this meeting, and to thank all the distinguished delegates for their interest and for their support to UNMIR and to the response in general. Thank you.
I thank the Special Representative and Head of United Nations Missions for Ebola Emergency Response. I now give the floor to Dr. David Nabarro, Special Envoy of the Secretary General on Ebola, to respond also.
Thank you, all of you members of this General Assembly. Thank you, Mr. President, for this discussion. I listened very carefully to the comments that were made, first of all by the representatives of the 3 most affected countries, and then by others who have participated in the discussion. Let's just highlight a few things that are worth, I believe, really treasuring. The first is the powerful leadership of the national governments, and in particular, the initiative that they have taken to meet under the format of the Mano River Union last Sunday, with the very powerful communique that they have produced, and their absolute determination to work as 3 and not as 1 in considering how they will advance through the next steps. Second, the emphasis that all of you have put on the shift in strategy towards intensive surveillance and case finding with the objective of moving towards 0. Thirdly, the confidence that you have shown in your United Nations system, and I've heard several mentions also of the key role being played by the World Health Organization, as well as the UN mission that is now in place. Clearly, the WHO is absolutely the center of everything that is happening right now. Fourthly, the consistent support that you're offering and the commitments that have been made by several of you to stay with the response until it is finished and on into recovery. Some very powerful remarks made. And I'd like to join the representative of Cuba in paying tribute to the 2 Cuban volunteers who've unfortunately died in their part in the response, but also particularly to our colleague who returned after he had Ebola. He's not the only one. There have been many working in the response who've got ill but have felt they have to go back once they've been cured. And lastly, I would like to further mention how the trust fund that several of you referred to has been a powerful and fantastic mechanism, and I do hope that some of you will find the opportunity to join us on Friday when we describe the work of the trust fund in an open briefing here in this building. Mr. President, thanks again for your leadership.
Your Excellencies, I'd like to thank you for turning up for this briefing. I'd also like to thank Mr. Ahmed, Dr. Nabarro, Susan Marcora, Secretary General, and all of you who participated in the briefing. I also want to thank you for your continued commitment to this Ebola initiative by the UN, and to say that now that we are going to walk the last mile, we should continue to redouble our commitment and make sure that we finish the very last mile because of the work that has been done. It's too much to let down the work that has been done. So I thank you for your commitment. I want to thank the members who made comments and commitments, and I hope that we can all remain seized with this matter. Now this meeting comes to an end, and I thank you very much. The Assembly is now concluded. Meeting is adjourned.